Good morning, everyone. Happy Mondays, and welcome to the news agenda with me, Fleet Street Fox. And today I'm joined by the Mirror's online political editor and a regular on this show, Dan Bloom. We're going to take you through the biggest stories of the day, what's hot and what's not. And through it all, we want you to ask us your questions. Dig into the comments, ask us whatever's burning a hole in your head, and we will do our best to answer them for you. Now, what have we got today? Well, it's budget week. So there has been an awful lot of briefing and leaking about what will or will not be in Rishi Sunak's economic plan, which he's announcing this week. But two of the most glaring omissions in what we know so far is either solving the problems of social care, which, as we know, has cost many, many lives, or anything for anyone under the age of about 25. So the Mirror has splashed today on an article that's been written by Gordon Brown. So Dan, can you take us through it? What does he say?
Well, he essentially says that, as you can see on the screen, that we're going to have a lost generation of people unless the Chancellor acts now. And he talks in his article, it's quite insightful about, comparing us now to the 1930s and the Great Depression. In the 30s, the unemployed stood at street corners, but now they sit isolated at home. And they can't get work experience or training. And he talks of a winter and spring of desolation. Now, what Gordon Brown is talking about is a few things put together. We're talking about universal credit potentially being either cut, which looks unlikely now, or the current level extended, but only until October. So sort of moving that cliff edge. And then the Chancellor's schemes for jobs, because there has been intervention in this crisis to help 18 to 24-year-olds and young people who are sort of long-term out of work into jobs. But they've been a little bit slow off the ground. So there was a kickstart scheme, which Gordon Brown talks about, which sort of aimed to give thousands upon thousands of these work placements to people to sort of get them back into the world of work. The problem is with COVID, work placements are the last thing on most businesses' minds. And as Gordon Brown puts it, there are more than 1,000 young men and women unemployed in each constituency, and on average, just 3 of them will have started a place on the Kickstart scheme.
Three?
There were some facts a couple of weeks ago that said that only about 2,000 people, or just under, had actually started placements. Our government insists there's a lot more in the pipeline, but I guess that it's one of those arguments where the Chancellor says he's doing something, and his critics will say, well, you're not doing enough.
Yeah, well, 997 people in every constituency unemployed, and only 3 have found a job through the government scheme. And the government scheme's not damn well working, is it? Now, Pam says, wow, Dishy Rishi, is this what media reporting has come to? We're trying our best, Pam. Give us a chance. I only just started, been on air for 3 minutes. Now, when he's talking about the long-term unemployed, that's an issue, because people who are unemployed long term are more likely to stay that way forever. And if you are young when you are unemployed, you're more likely to stay that way forever as well. So being long term unemployed and under the age of 25 or 30 is quite critical for the next 30 years, isn't it, of tax take and economic growth and everything else. But it's noticeable that they're not really being mentioned so far in the leaks. And that's because, I suppose, the government are leaking the things that they think are going to get the most uptick and the most support, and younger people don't vote, so they don't feature as prominently in these things.
Well, it's a funny old world, isn't it? Because we used to, in budget week, it used to be sort of a mystery until the day, and they'd be very serious about not saying anything that's in the budget. Now, and of course, we're grateful for news coverage, but it's comes with its own problems. We get these sort of daily official sort of trails of what will be in the budget from about 5 days out. And of course, you get about 2 or 3 weeks of leaks to perhaps what might be called the friendlier papers about what might be in the budget. Now, these don't tend to come, directly from the Chancellor, but sometimes they're ideas that are sort of kicked out there by someone adjacent to, and to maybe see how they're going to go down and see what the reaction is going to be, because then they could be pulled from the budget if they don't go down very well. And that seems to be what's been happening. So we've had all sorts of talk of stamp duties. We've had a stamp duty cut being extended. We've had this is the one that sort of slightly irked me over the weekend, the return of 95% mortgages. That we know that one's coming. That's an official trail. The problem with that is, of course, that what it's doing is it's making the incredibly expensive housing in this country easier to get a mortgage for, an enormous mortgage for. It doesn't make the housing itself any cheaper or more plentiful. It's not a house building program. It's just managing to get you onto the ladder in its current state. So, Susie's right. There's a lot of stuff that hasn't been covered here that we will hope will be there on Wednesday, but won't necessarily be there.
Yeah. Now, Daniel says, do we really think this government's doing enough for people who aren't fortunate enough to find work? The people who aren't fortunate enough to earn over £50,000 a year? I'm not sure they are. Is anybody sure they are, Daniel, is the question. And the same problem with social care. Now, this is something that's been kicked into the long grass repeatedly by governments, to be fair, of all stripes for the past 20 odd years. We know something has to be done about social care. The pandemic has proved it very conclusively. And Boris Johnson's pledge when he took over in Downing Street to do something about social care has been pushed back and pushed back and pushed back and pushed back. Are we going to get some kind of solution in the budget? Because it hasn't been leaked out.
No, is the short answer. And perhaps I will have to eat my hat on Thursday. But what we've been told is that this plan for social care might come by the end of the year now. So clearly that's quite a long way off. I don't think anyone suggested that we're going to get a solution in the budget. What we could get is something that we've had in previous budgets, where the Chancellor, say, announces £1 billion or £2 billion for social care. That's happened in the past. The problem with that is it's a sticking plaster. It just it doesn't solve any of the problems, any of the structural problems with the fact that as a nation we're a lot older than we were in the last generation and will be a lot older in the generation to come.
Exactly. Now, Michelle says, the self-employed will get hit again. I'm self-employed, Michelle. I feel your pain. As will those on benefits. It's always the ones who can't afford to shoulder the burden that get given it. Maybe close the tax loopholes and start getting back the money they've squirreled away instead. Now, Rishi has suggested that there's going to be a task force for getting back some of the COVID money that fraudsters have got their hands on. But HMRC's resources have been quite badly cut over the past few years. And it's a lot easier to come after the little guys like Michelle or like me than it is to go after, the big tech companies who are moving all their profits offshore. So, you've got to go after the low-hanging fruit first. And is that going to be the self-employed?
Well, we don't think there's something coming on the self-employed in the budget itself, but we have got a bit of a D-Day coming down the track because there's a review of how business rates and all sorts of things like that works. And on March the 23rd, they are due to sort of publish a whole load of consultations and calls for evidence and all this technical stuff, which is the government taking the first step to some kind of tax change in the autumn. So the rumours over the weekend have been that the self-employed might have their national insurance contributions kind of assaulted, if you like, as part of that. And obviously that's an area they've been trying to reform for a long time and kind of ended up backtracking on and all that sort of thing. So it's been in the pipeline for a while. Won't be in the budget, we don't think, but it could be one of these things that comes down the road later on.
And as Gordon Brown says in his article there as well, he can't believe that Rishi Sunak even contemplated the £20 cut or the removal of the uplift, of the £20 uplift in universal credit, although we are assured that's still going to stay, at least for a bit. Now, Craig says, after World War II, there was massive investment in infrastructure. That's the way out. Tax the rich and those who profited directly from lockdown, e.g. delivery companies, Amazon and whatnot. That seems quite sensible, but it means more borrowing, doesn't it? And we've already borrowed quite a lot. And it's against the Tory ideology, isn't it, of spending for something that may not benefit the country for another 20 or 30 years. That's what infrastructure means. If we all got, fibre optic broadband tomorrow, our GDP might rise, but it would be over a couple of decades. And that's not going to give them an instant hit and instant improvement to their electoral chances right now, which is that's how they budget for these things, isn't it? It's how to get re-elected next time.
So there's a couple of things on this. They do say they're looking at infrastructure in the budget. For example, they're sort of expanding this role of a national infrastructure bank they've got a green bond that sort of savers could buy into. Now, that's one way of funding infrastructure, but it's not going to go all the way, as Susie says. And the sort of tax the rich argument is the very controversial one at the moment, because there were thoughts that perhaps they would go for a windfall tax, looking at firms that have made maybe excessive profits during the pandemic, like Amazon and some of the supermarkets, and have a sort of one-off tax that way. The latest rumours, again, just rumours, but reporting over the weekend, is that perhaps the Chancellor is moving away from that. And what we do know is that an online sales tax, which they've talked about for a long time, to sort of have some parity with business rates, because if you run a shop, you have to pay these enormous business rates. And if you run an Amazon warehouse, it's a completely different situation. There was going to be some kind of maybe a tax on every online sale that you make. So Amazon would suddenly have to pay a lot more tax. That isn't happening in the budget. That's only being looked at as part of this thing for the future that I was talking about that might come in the autumn or might not. So it's perhaps a question of priorities, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And of course, if you start taxing online sales, all that means is that the people who are buying things online have to pay more. It's not that Amazon suddenly start to making fewer profits or whatever. And the mom and pop kitchen table businesses who use eBay or whatever to sell stuff and to run a small business from home, they're going to have, lower take on what's a very minimal amount of money, perhaps. Now, Sally Stone says, "What is this new coronavirus fairing I heard this morning? There's another type from Brazil." Thank you, Sally, because you take us straight into our next story. What a beautiful segue. Now, research has shown that perhaps 200,000 frontline medics have not had the vaccine yet. And this is research because the government won't release the figures. So the Sunday Times had to counter stuff up from the data. And there are lots of things to discuss with this, but I want to concentrate on this, our next spread, the story in the papers, talking about the new variant, the problems with these heroes, the NHS staff who are not having the jabs, perhaps 200,000 of them. And on the right-hand side there, sorry, it's this side on the thing, on the right-hand side there, a doctor in the New Dispatches documentary revealing what it's really like on the front line. And Dr. Saleha Arsan, who's pictured there at the top, says it was predicted it was going to get bad in November, and it did. I'm really angry because this was avoidable. And she says that it could get worse again, that Boris Johnson's roadmap is not the way out, apparently. There's still more potentially problems in the next year. So, Dan, is she right? Are we going to face this again? Is it to do with jabs? Is it to do with this new variant? What's happening?
I bloody well hope not, Susie. I think we all do. But there are a couple of worrying signs, despite obviously the huge success of the vaccine programme. There's a couple of sort of red lights on the dashboard. The first one is that on Friday's press conference, why they announced this on a sunny Friday afternoon, maybe it should have come earlier in the week, but they've got cases rising in 1 in 5 areas in England, and some sort of warning signs that it might be ticking up again. Now you've got a separate problem, which was announced in great hurry and at very short notice last night, of this variant that Sally is referring to, coming from Brazil. Now, this is called the P1 variant. It was first found in Manaus, and it's worrying the scientists because Manaus, they thought, had reached herd immunity. There were so many people who'd been infected that they thought that would sort of suppress infections in the future. But actually, they had this huge uptick in cases in January, and they suspect that, is there something to do with the new variant? Now, it's very early days. We don't know if it does resist the vaccine. We don't know for sure if it reinfects people. And we don't know, perhaps it may spread more easily than other variants. All those things are still being looked at. What we do know is we want to keep it out of the country. And the problem is 6 cases all coming just before hotel quarantine in mid-February and detected sort of on Friday are now in the country. 5 of them are thought to be under control, but there's one person who took a test, didn't register it properly, or the registration didn't come through online, probably a home kit or something, and sent it off. And now they have a test positive with this variant that they do not have a name for. They don't know where it was taken. They're asking anyone who took a test. So this test was processed on Valentine's Day, right? So they think it was taken by the person on February the 12th or the 13th. So if you took a test on February the 12th or the 13th, you're being asked to call a phone number, which I don't have in front of me, but is in our article on the website. Go to our homepage and you'll find it. Mike Holden asked if only we'd invested some money in tracking and tracing infections, eh? Well, if only we'd put 22 billion into it, that would probably be handy. Less on that.
And if only we'd close the borders and actually close them properly, rather than, because these 6 people have come in on a plane with however many other people. They have come through passport control. They've stood at the luggage carousel. They've used the public toilets on the route. And it's not just 6, is it? These are just the 6 that we know about so far. Mike says again, very keen this morning, Mike, anyone know why this news of worldwide new variants has been around for months and we still haven't put in proper quarantine measures? Now, as it says in the article there, if we don't close our borders, this is just going to keep happening, and not just to some countries, but every country in the world. And you've got to have testing of every single person who comes in before they leave the airport. Other countries have done that. Why haven't we? We could have spent 22 billion on that. We'd all be in a better situation, wouldn't we?
Well, it's one of those hindsight things, I guess, but a lot of people were calling for it at the time, and it didn't happen. I guess what the government would say is that the enormous cost and the social cost of doing that made it very, very difficult at the time, and they made a choice not to. And now we have the issue of new variants, which is perhaps more of an issue than it was being trailed as last summer. Because last summer it was, this deadly virus is going to kill us all, and this summer it's we're vaccinated against this deadly virus, but we may have a few sort of escape pods shoot through and reinfect the population. So exactly. It's suddenly the issue of controlling international cases coming in, it becomes hugely more important than it was, and the countries that we were very slow to act on that, and the countries that acted very, very quickly are now reaping the benefits.
Exactly. And all of them island nations, most of those who've done much better than us, it's worth saying. Now, Mark says, so millions of people have been jabbed with something that's totally pointless. No, Mark, it's not totally pointless. You are still protected from the variants that are circulating mostly in this country. That vaccination will still stop you getting severe illness. It will still stop you being hospitalized, and it will still stop you spreading it to others. So the jab is completely and utterly, totally worthwhile. If there are new variants coming in because we have an absolutely rubbish government, then that is something that may require a new jab. But some of the new variants we've seen already, Dan, they're not something that has been able to escape the vaccine so far. The vaccine has still been effective on them, although we don't know to what extent quite. So, and we're still waiting to find out about this new one, aren't we?
The really important thing here is that's right. It's that we have no data on it, but there are suspicions that it's possible because there's some vaccine resistance with the South Africa one, and there are similar mutations. But the important point to make here is when we talk about the vaccine, not working on the variants, we're talking about the vaccine not working as well. It's a gradient, and having people vaccinated is still better than not having people vaccinated. And it's all a case of degrees. And the government are always looking at this as the mass effects on the population, not the effect on just you. So they're looking at what happens if the vaccine only resists, 60% of cases or severe infections rather than 90, for example. That will have a different effect on how it spreads through the community and but it's not that you've got no protection. It's not that the vaccine is useless. And in fact, when they're talking about getting a new vaccine, they're actually talking about getting a booster this winter, which would only be 1 shot rather than 2, and would sort of top up with, new spike proteins or what have you. So it's, still go and get jabbed, and if you want to give your place to me, I'd happily take it up, but I don't think that's allowed.
No, I'm not sure it is, no. Now, Ron says, it's shocking we've got so far down the road fighting this virus while not covering the variables. You're right, Ron. And I think as well, if we do get any kind of an uptick, there are going to be people, maybe even some in Parliament, who say this is due to the fact that 200,000 frontline medics haven't had the jab, or people in minority ethnic communities haven't had the jab. But a lot of it, I want people to remember, may well be due to border controls and test and trace and not being paid proper isolation payments because 7 out of 8 people who apply for them don't get them, in order to help people isolate and protect them and stop this pandemic getting worse. And that's a government issue. That's nothing to do with frontline medics getting their jabs or not. Jackie says, if people are so concerned about people getting vaccinated, why isn't it made compulsory? Dan, do you want to take this one? Because I'm sure it's something that's been discussed a lot at government level.
Just throw the hot potato over to me. So the government say, no, we will not be making it compulsory. And the reason for that is because it goes beyond just the public health element. It's an ethical, moral issue. Now, it depends what you mean a little bit by compulsory, doesn't it? Because the government is not making the vaccine compulsory for the reason that the government forcing people to be vaccinated is a sort of Rubicon that they do not want to cross in a democratic country. However, there are some employers, such as some care home firms, that are saying that perhaps they won't employ people on new contracts who haven't got the vaccine without, a medical reason. If they're immunocompromised or something, there are some people who can't have it. And there's a study going on looking at sort of passports. Now, this is vaccine or testing passports. So they're looking at re-engineering the COVID-19 app so that if you go to a big gig or a venue or something, nightclub, you could show either that you've been vaccinated or potentially instead that you've had like a rapid test in the day before you went to the nightclub. And that would help you get in. Now, the reason why it's an either or at the moment is because it's such an ethical issue, because you'd be making the vaccine compulsory by stealth sort of thing. You'd be saying, no, it's not compulsory, but you can't take full part in society if you don't have it. Now, a lot of people have very strong views on this. And I think it does go beyond the usual sort of vax or anti-vaxxer sort of debate. There are some genuine sort of issues here. But what the government is following very clearly is a strategy to tell people how good the vaccine is, encourage them to take it. And so far, that does seem to be working. Like in the care home workers and some NHS staff, there are some problems there in take-up. They're very serious problems. But overall, you've got sort of the over 70s and the over 80s have taken the vaccine in absolutely enormous numbers, like way better than the government thought it would be. And that's good news for all of us. And hopefully that will continue.
Yeah. Leslie Holmes, morning, Leslie, says, you go and get jabbed. What bloody variants? They make it up as they go along. It's the bloody flu. The bloody flu would be significantly worse than the actual flu, which still kills a lot of people. Unfortunately, Leslie, COVID-19 is 5 to 10 times more deadly than the flu. It's a vascular disease, not a respiratory one. So one of the things it does is it affects those bits of your body that have the smallest blood vessels, right? Which is where there's exchange that takes place across blood vessels. So in your kidneys, in your extremities, in your toes, when people get COVID toe, in your brain and in your lungs. So it does affect your lungs, and it can affect all these other bits of your body where there's teeny tiny blood vessels, and it causes blockages in there, as well as having as we know, the transmission through your nose and mouth and spittle and so on. There are plenty of variants. They're not being made up. They're being found by scientists who can definitely show you them if you knew any. And Leslie, if you don't get jabbed, that's fine, because hopefully the people around you will get jabbed and they'll be protecting you. If you or your children, for example, or someone you know or love has an immune system problem, which means they cannot have the jab, say they're getting chemotherapy, say they've got cancer, say they've got some other condition, then they are potentially exposed to the virus if you have it because you haven't had the jab. And you could potentially be killing other people because it is 5 to 10 times more deadly than the flu. And in order for it to be as safe as the flu that we live with on a fairly regular basis, as so many idiots keep telling us, it's got to mutate thousands and thousands of times to make it less deadly and more dominant. And when we have those evolution and those mutations, as Dan's just said, we have potential for variants that are more deadly and worse and more contagious. And we still don't know quite about this one. Dan, is there anything you want to say to Leslie?
I would just say that having covered government for a while now, we so often cover issues of competence rather than issues of conspiracy. And I think if they're making it up as they go along, that implies that all of this has been sort of invented in some way. And I just think, stop and think about how likely that actually is, and whether we're all in on it as well.
Yeah. If it is all made up, then the government has spent many, many hundreds of billions of pounds making itself look really bad. Would you make that up? Because I wouldn't personally. Anyway, thank you, Leslie. We've got some good news, though. There is some happy stuff happening in the world, and we're going to tell you about it right now. Ta-da! There it is, page 2 of the Mirror. Now, in the pandemic, 12.4 million people volunteered to help out. And there were lots of stories about whether they were or were not able to actually get to the point where they were helping drive people to hospital. They've been helping at the vaccination centres and so on. And a study has found that 3/4 of them would do it again. 41% said their neighbourhood was more united, and they've been speaking to their neighbours and being friendlier. And this is the really good bit. Only about 10% of them, in each cases, describe themselves as leavers or remainers. Dan, does this mean Brexit is finally over? Our divisions are gone. We're a happy nation once more.
I can't help feeling that you've got two groups of society in Britain. You've got the people on Twitter who were arguing about Brexit, and then you've got the people who've gone become volunteers. And, actually, it's any study that finds only 10% of people are calling themselves a Remainer and the same for Leaver is, reminds us that there's a lot of people who actually didn't have a massive dog in the fight of the story that we were covering for so many years, day after day after day, still covering now. And a lot of people, want to get on and make us a better country, regardless of what's happening in Westminster. It's just a sign of that. I think it's brilliant. Makes me wish I'd volunteered, feel bad for not having done so. And, I think I can see why people want to do it again, because it's a slight kind of silver lining to come out of all the gloom we've had in the last year, isn't it? That people have helped each other and people have stepped up to the plate. So I don't mean to sound like a Tory minister at a press conference, but step
up to the plate, come on.
I want to thank my team and all that stuff. No, I think it's great.
It's been proven that you have this helper effect, that it makes you feel better if you were helping other people. So it's a bit of good news. Perhaps Brexit is finally done with, and communities are a bit more cohesive, of taking care of one another, keeping an eye out for one another, and just hope it doesn't all evaporate after this is over and done with. Now, thank you, Dan, for joining me this morning. What day is it? This morning. It's all the same. It just blurs into one when I'm sat at this computer. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Thank you, Leslie. Go and get the vaccination if you can, or maybe just Google stuff. I don't know. And we'll see us all again on Wednesday. And the news agenda will be back to explain probably some more stuff to do with the budget, I expect. Right. Thank you for joining us, everyone. Go about your day. Bye-bye.